While my cousins were clinking champagne glasses over their $1 million inheritances at my grandfather's funeral, I stood with trembling hands staring at a wrinkled envelope. Inside wasn't a deed to land nor a check with too many zeros to count, just a faded bus ticket to a nowhere town in Arizona. They laughed, some even filmed me to post online. But what they didn't know is that this scrap of paper held the key to a secret that would flip everything upside down. Before I go further, I want to pause and invite you in. Stories like this stir something deep, don't they? Tell me. In the comments. What are you feeling right now? And where in the world are you watching from? I read every comment and would love to hear your perspective. And if this story draws you in, don't forget to subscribe and share it. Helps keep these real life-changing journeys alive for more people like us. My name is Harold Miller. I'm 67 years old, a retired Navy machinist who spent the last 2 decades in Florida fixing lawnmowers and outboard motors for neighbors who pay in cash, and sometimes in pies. My life has been quiet, ordinary even. I live in a weather-worn trailer on the outskirts of Pensacola, where the Gulf breeze carries the smell of salt and rust. Nothing about me screamed heir to a fortune. And maybe that was exactly the point. Charles Whitman. My grandfather wasn't just a man, he was a Texas legend. He built a logistics empire out of cattle trucks and shipping routes, turned dust into dollars, and raised his family to believe that wealth was the only proof of love. My cousins embodied that gospel. Chad strutted in an Armani suit as if he'd already been crowned CEO. Melissa hid behind oversized sunglasses, already fantasizing about the New York penthouse she would post on Instagram. And my brother Vernon, always my shadow-turned-rival, stood at the lawyer's table grinning like a wolf who finally tasted blood. When the attorney read the will, the room glittered with diamonds and false gratitude. To Vernon, the horse ranch and Dallas estates. To Chad, controlling shares of the company. To Melissa, the penthouse and the yacht. The words rolled like thunder, each inheritance grander than the last. Then silence. My name was called, and the attorney slid the battered envelope across the polished oak table. The laughter that followed was louder than any storm. Someone whispered, "A bus ticket. That's all he gets." Another voice. "Maybe he should pawn it for gas money." Vernon's son filmed my expression, zooming in on the humiliation carved into my face. But I didn't flinch. Not the way they wanted. I folded the ticket, slipped it into my pocket, and let the laughter wash over me. I'd survived war zones, lost friends in the surf of foreign harbors, and buried the love of my life without shedding a tear in public. Their cruelty felt like the buzzing of flies compared to those storms. Still, when I stepped outside into the heavy Texas dusk, the weight of that envelope grew. Why me? Why here? Why now? I lifted my eyes to the reddening sky and whispered words no one else could hear. "Grandpa, you old fox. You set the board long before any of us knew we were playing. And if this is your last move, I'll make mine. I'll take that bus. I'll see what you left hidden." And just like that, my quiet life cracked open, and the game began. The night after the funeral, I drove my rusted Ford pickup back to Florida, the bus ticket folded like a riddle in my pocket. The road stretched out before me, headlights carving tunnels through the southern dark. My cousins were probably sipping champagne in penthouses, already forgetting my face twisted by their laughter. But as the miles rolled under my tires, I couldn't help drifting back through the long corridors of my own life, the kind of life no one at that oak-paneled table had ever bothered to see. I wasn't born to wealth. I was born to grease and grit. At 17, I worked under the hoods of cars in a garage that smelled of oil and desperation. By 19, the Navy had me on a ship in the Pacific, wrench in hand, patching engines that coughed and groaned like dying beasts. That's where I learned that survival wasn't about looking sharp in Armani, but knowing which bolt would keep the whole vessel from sinking. Those years left scars, some on my skin, others deep inside, but they also gave me a kind of pride money could never buy. After the service, I came home to a trailer leaning against time itself, its aluminum siding faded by decades of Gulf storms. Inside, the air still carried the faint perfume of Rose, my wife, though she'd been gone 10 years. Cancer took her quick like a thief who doesn't bother closing the door behind him. Her laughter once filled these thin walls, and now the silence is so heavy I sometimes keep the television on just to break it. My daughter Emily lives 2 states away and calls less than she should. There's a wall between us built from years of misunderstanding. She believes I chose duty over family, that my years at sea were proof I abandoned her mother when she needed me most. I never found the words to explain that I went where I was ordered, that my hands turned wrenches so she could have a future. Some truths corrode in silence until they feel like rust you can't scrub off. It's a strange thing how the world can forget a man while he's still alive. In my neighborhood, I'm the old guy who fixes lawnmowers for $20 and a slice of pie. Kids ride past on bikes and don't know I once kept destroyers afloat in storms that made the ocean roar like Judgment Day. My cousins saw me as the family embarrassment, the one who walked away from easy money. Maybe I did. Maybe I chose peace over power, a wrench over a briefcase. But standing outside my trailer at night, listening to the cicadas scream, I often wondered if peace had been a coward's choice. And yet, in my memory, one voice always rises above the rest, Grandpa Charles. He was never warm, never soft, but he had a way of cutting through pretense with a single sentence. Harold, he once told me, his eyes like steel under the Texas sun. Any fool can shine when the lights are on. Real worth shows when no one is watching. I didn't fully grasp it back then. Maybe I still don't. But sitting in that funeral hall, watching my family preen over their inheritances, I realized he'd left me more than a bus ticket. He'd left me a test. They believe I am the forgotten man, the leftover branch of the Whitman tree. But perhaps Charles saw in me what he never found in the others, a man shaped by silence, weathered by storms, not polished for show. The irony is sharp. The ones who lived for his approval got castles of sand, and the one who walked away may hold the only thing that lasts. So as I lay in bed that night, the ticket heavy in my pocket, I whispered into the dark trailer, "Grandpa, if this is the last lesson you've set for me, I'll take it. I'll follow where it leads, even if no one believes I should. Because maybe you were right. Real worth begins in the shadows." And with that vow, my past and present collided, and the road to Arizona began to burn in my mind like a map lit from within. The memory of that night in my trailer blurred into the next morning, when the image of the bus ticket still pulsed in my mind like a wound that refused to close. And with it came the echo of my grandfather's words, a reminder that real worth hides in the dark. That echo carried me back to the day itself, to the room where the stage had been set, where all of us gathered not to mourn, but to measure what Charles Whitman had left behind. The Whitman will was read in a chamber that could have doubled as a museum. Oak-paneled walls absorbed the dim light from chandeliers that hung like frozen thunderbolts. The air smelled of leather and old money, of cigars smoked decades ago, and victories no one remembered clearly. The mahogany table stretched between us like a battlefield, each side lined with faces hungry for spoils. Vernon, my older brother, sat stiff-backed beside his wife, Margaret, who wore enough diamonds to light the room if the bulbs failed. His smirk betrayed certainty. He was convinced the ranch in Dallas, the horses, and the acreage would be his, as if possession had already taken place in his mind. Next to him was Chad, his son, my nephew, the self-declared prodigy of the family. His watch glittered like a lighthouse, his posture dripping with entitlement. He whispered to Melissa, my niece, who hid behind her sunglasses though we were indoors. Melissa, the self-made brand, lived for filters and followers, already daydreaming about penthouses and yachts before the words were spoken. The lawyer, Mr. Gaines, adjusted his wire rim glasses, cleared his throat, and began. His voice carried the weight of formality. Yet I swore I saw something flicker in his eyes when he glanced my way. To Vernon Whitman and his wife. Margaret, I leave the Whitman Horse Ranch and adjoining estates in Dallas. Margaret gasped theatrically, clutching Vernon's arm, as though the news of their fortune had struck like lightning. Vernon nodded already, victorious, already calculating. To my grandson, Chad Whitman, I leave full controlling interest in Whitman Freight and Logistics, provided he maintains current employment levels for at least 1 year. Chad leapt to his feet so fast, his chair screamed across the polished floor. I knew it, he barked, raising his phone, as though the LinkedIn update to CEO had already been typed. To my granddaughter, Melissa Whitman, I leave the penthouse at Central Park West and the yacht Margaret's Grace currently moored in Newport Harbor. Melissa squealed, her laughter bouncing off the wood like broken glass. My followers are going to die, she cried, already imagining her next viral post. The room shifted, all eyes on me now, as Mr. Gaines reached for a smaller, weather-beaten envelope. He hesitated just a second, but enough for me to notice. His voice softened. To my grandson, Harold Miller, I leave this. He slid the envelope across the table. Its edges frayed my name, written in Charles's unsteady hand. My heart hammered as I picked it up. Inside was not a deed, not a stock certificate, just a one-way Greyhound bus ticket to a town in Arizona most of them had never heard of. The silence lasted 2 seconds before it fractured into laughter. Vernon chuckled first, deep and cruel. Chad roared, a bus ticket. That's priceless. Melissa lifted her phone, recording the humiliation for her online audience. Even Margaret leaned back, smiling with venom. But Mr. Gaines wasn't finished. He raised his hand for quiet. There is also a letter. It is sealed. Mr. Whitman instructed that it is to be opened only when Harold arrives at the destination printed on the ticket. The laughter died, though smirks lingered. A ripple of confusion moved across their faces. Vernon leaned forward, voice sharp. Surely this is a mistake. Harold has no business with hidden letters or secret trips. He's Harold. But I heard something else in that moment. Not mockery, not even doubt. It was fear, faint but present, that my grandfather had left me a piece of the puzzle none of them could see. I tucked the envelope into my pocket, rose from my chair, and let their stares bore into me. If he wanted me to go, I said evenly, then I'll go. The air tightened, the room hushed. For once, their laughter had no power. The game my grandfather began was unfolding, and though I was the only one holding a bus ticket, I realized I might also be the only one holding the truth. That night, as I packed a single bag in my trailer, the words circled in my mind. A letter only to be opened upon arrival. Whatever waited for me in that forgotten town in Arizona was no accident. My grandfather's last move had been played. Now, it was my turn. The night after the will reading, I slept little. The laughter of my family echoed in my head, but louder still was the whisper of that envelope burning in my pocket. By dawn, I'd packed a single duffel, locked the door of my trailer, and set out for the Greyhound station. I'd lived 67 years on familiar roads, but as I stepped onto that bus bound for Arizona, I knew I was leaving more than Florida behind. I was leaving the man my family thought I was. The bus smelled of diesel and old leather, its windows streaked with dust from 1,000 forgotten journeys. I chose a seat halfway back, the kind that let me see everyone without being seen too much myself. Across the aisle sat a woman in her 70s, her hair silver, but her posture proud. She caught me watching and gave a small smile. Linda, she introduced herself, her voice warm, practiced. She was a retired nurse from Georgia, traveling west to visit her sister. Something in the tilt of her head, the steady kindness of her gaze, pulled Rose back into my memory. For a moment, the ache of loss felt less sharp. A few rows ahead, a young man slouched against the window, his camouflage jacket frayed at the sleeves. His eyes were distant, hollow. I knew that look. It was the gaze of someone who had walked through fire and come back without a map for living. Later, I'd learn his name was Jacob, an Iraq veteran estranged from his father. He hadn't spoken to him in years. Pain recognizes its own kind, and though he never said it, I could tell Jacob saw something in me too. Hours stretched into miles. The bus rattled across state lines past pine forests that gave way to desert plains. Somewhere in the quiet, I pulled the envelope back out. That's when I saw it barely visible in pencil, so faint it could have been missed. 1953. My breath caught. That was the year my father died, at his desk, heart giving out before he ever had a chance to fight for his share of the Whitman legacy. My grandfather never spoke of it, never allowed questions. Why mark that year now in this way? The ticket wasn't just a destination. It was a key, and 1953 was the lock it was meant to open. The desert sun fell hard against the windows, baking the bus, until the air grew heavy with sweat. Just past the New Mexico border, the engine groaned, coughed, and died. The driver cursed, pulling us to the shoulder where sand stretched endless on both sides. People muttered, shifted restlessly, panic bubbling. I stood, old instincts stirring. Once a machinist, always a machinist. I asked the driver to pop the hood. He looked skeptical. What could a retiree with white hair do? But when I leaned into the smoke and heat, I saw the problem in minutes. A loose belt, worn thin, threatening to snap completely. My hands worked without thought, steady and sure. The heat burned my palms, grease stained my shirt, but when the engine roared back to life, the bus filled with cheers. Linda clapped her hands. Jacob gave me a nod, silent but heavy with respect. For a moment I wasn't the forgotten man. I was the one who carried us forward. As we rolled back onto the highway, the desert glowing under a crimson sky, I leaned against the window and thought about my grandfather. He must have known I'd take this journey, must have trusted that I'd find strength not in riches but in resilience. And as the bus pushed deeper into the wasteland, I realized something unsettling. The journey itself was part of the inheritance. Each mile was stripping away the man my family mocked, revealing someone else underneath, someone even I hadn't fully met yet. And somewhere up ahead, in a town, I couldn't yet imagine, a letter waited to tell me why. The bus groaned into the tiny Arizona station, just as the sun dipped low, staining the desert sky in blood and gold. Dust swirled with each step I took down the metal stairs, the heat clinging even in the evening. I expected silence, maybe emptiness, but instead, I saw a figure leaning against an old Chevy pickup, the kind of truck that looked like it had lived more lives than most men. Mr. Miller, the man, called his voice gravelly with age. I nodded. That's me. He stepped forward, weathered hands gripping the brim of his hat. "Name's Joe. Your granddaddy hired me once long time ago. Been waiting for you." Something in his tone sent a shiver through me. Hired him. For what? Before I could ask, he took my bag as if it weighed nothing and tossed it into the truck bed. "Come on. We've got a drive ahead of us." The Chevy rattled over cracked roads that bled into endless desert. Miles slipped by in silence, broken only by the engine's cough and the occasional howl of wind through cactus. At last, Joe turned onto a narrow dirt path framed by dry mesquite trees, leading to what looked like the bones of a house standing stubbornly against time. The farmhouse was old, its white paint peeled to gray, its porch sagging under years of neglect. But the moment I stepped out, I felt a presence, a weight in the air, as though the ground itself remembered every secret buried here. From the doorway emerged a woman. Her hair was silver braided down her back, her shoulders still straight, though age had softened her. Her eyes, dark, deep, and trembling, locked on me. Tears spilled instantly as if she'd been holding them for decades. "Harold," she whispered, voice breaking on the syllables. "You look like him. Too much like him." I froze. "Like who?" She pressed a hand to her chest, steadying herself. "Charles, your grandfather, the man who promised me forever and left me with silence." The words hit like a hammer. My grandfather, rigid, disciplined. Charles Whitman had carried a hidden life. Joe's voice filled the stillness. "Harold, this here is Elena. She knew your granddaddy better than most." Elena stepped closer, her weathered hands trembling as they brushed against my arm. "I was his love once. We met when he came here after the war. We built dreams in this desert, dreams that never saw the light. He gave me a son, Antonio." The name caught in her throat and I felt my stomach tighten. He was everything she said, eyes wet with memory. But life was cruel. A car accident took him when he was barely 30, gone in a flash. He left behind 2 children, my grandchildren. They've grown without knowing the truth of who their grandfather was, without knowing that Charles Whitman's blood runs in their veins. I gripped the railing of the porch, its wood splintering under my hand. Antonio. A name I'd never heard, a cousin I'd never known, a branch of the family tree cut and hidden. And behind me, I could still hear my cousin's laughter from the will, reading their smug delight as they clutched their hollow inheritances. Elena looked at me, then eyes burning not with bitterness but with pleading. He promised me once that his family would find mine, that what was stolen in silence would be restored in truth. You are that promise, Harold. You are the one he sent. The desert air pressed down heavy, and in that moment I understood my grandfather had left me not wealth, but a wound to heal, a history to confront. And perhaps in the ruins of this farmhouse, in the faces of the grandchildren I had yet to meet, lay the real inheritance he intended all along. Elena's words lingered in the twilight air, her tears catching the last streaks of sun as they slid down her lined cheeks. I felt my chest tighten, not just from the weight of what she revealed, but from the envelope still resting against my ribs, the one the lawyer had said could only be opened here in this place. My hands shook as I pulled it from my pocket, its paper worn soft, like something meant to survive decades. Joe and Elena stood silently as I broke the seal. Inside was a single folded letter written in my grandfather's familiar, deliberate script. His voice came alive with each line, steady and commanding even from the grave. "Harold, if you are reading this, then you trusted me enough to follow where others would only laugh. Good. That trust is the only reason this belongs to you. For most of my life, I lived as 2 men, one who carried the Whitman name with pride in Texas, and another who walked this desert under the name no one dared speak. Elena was my truth, and Antonio was my blood. But fear made me a coward. I left them in the shadows and built walls of silence. That choice has haunted me more than all the wealth I ever built. I paused, my throat dry. The words blurred for a moment before I forced myself to continue. You have something your brother Vernon never had the ability to see people as more than possessions. He knows how to guard riches, but you, Harold, you know how to guard hearts. That is why this is yours. The vineyard you stand on now, the land Antonio worked with his bare hands, the home Elena built from dust. It all belongs to you. Alongside it, a trust of $30 million, enough to sustain the work for generations. But it is not money I leave you, Harold. It is a burden and a gift. Restore this family. Connect what I tore apart. Mend what I shattered. This is the real inheritance. The paper rattled. As I lowered it, the desert wind tugging at its edges. My mind reeled. A vineyard. $30 million. It sounded like fantasy, yet here it was, scrawled in ink that carried the weight of truth. Elena reached for my hand, her grip strong despite her years. He told me long ago that one day his blood would return here. I never believed it. But when I see you, Harold, I believe. I looked out across the barren fields stretching beyond the farmhouse. At first glance they were dead, forgotten. But in the fading light I noticed rows upon rows of vines, skeletal but alive, stubborn against the desert's cruelty. Antonio had once walked here, planting roots my grandfather never had the courage to claim. And now, somehow, that responsibility was mine. The irony hit like a thunderclap. My cousins, drunk on hollow victories, believed they'd inherited empires. Yet their fortunes were sand slipping through greedy fingers. And me, the man mocked with a bus ticket, now held the only inheritance that carried weight, the chance to heal a wound deeper than any ledger could measure. I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling my grandfather's words burn through the paper. This wasn't just property. It was confession, redemption, and a command. For the first time in years, I felt something stir inside me. Not bitterness, not defeat, but a purpose sharp enough to cut through every doubt. I looked at Elena, her eyes shimmering with both grief and hope, and I realized the truth. The inheritance wasn't to make me rich. It was to make me whole. And maybe, just maybe, to make us all whole again. The letter still burned in my chest the next morning, as sunlight spilled across the desert vines. For the first time in years, I felt steady, like a man standing where he was meant to. But while I was finding roots, I never knew I had my family back in Texas, was learning just how fragile their empires really were. It started with Chad. My nephew, the self-declared prodigy, strutted into Whitman Freight and Logistics as if the world already owed him reverence. Within weeks, the facade began to crack. The books revealed debts buried under creative accounting contracts, written on promises that never had substance. Shipments delayed, clients pulled out, and soon the empire he bragged about was nothing more than a sinking vessel. I heard whispers that the banks circled like vultures, ready to seize whatever scraps remained. The boy who laughed at my bus ticket now sat in a corner office with empty phones, staring at ledgers that read like tombstones. Melissa's fall was swifter. The penthouse she paraded on Instagram had been mortgaged 3 times over her yacht, leased with money she didn't own. When the creditors came, her curated world collapsed overnight. One morning, she was posting pictures of champagne flutes against the New York skyline. The next, she was carrying boxes down a marble staircase, while strangers cataloged her belongings for auction. Her followers didn't see the tears, only the silence that replaced her feed. And Vernon, my brother, the man who always wore his arrogance like armor. He and Margaret clung to the Dallas horse ranch as though it could shield them, but debts do not bend to pride. They sold horses, then land, until nothing remained but a hollow house and a bitterness too heavy to carry. By the time the foreclosure notice came, Vernon's voice had lost its thunder. He was just an old man watching the gates close on everything he thought he controlled. It was around this time the phone calls began. First Chad, his tone stripped of bravado. "Uncle Harold," he muttered, voice cracked. "I need advice. Maybe help." Days later, Melissa's message arrived shaky and brittle. "I know I haven't been kind, but please can we talk?" And finally Vernon himself, the man who once called me a fool. His words came slow like swallowing glass. "Harold, you've always been steady. We need you." I sat on the porch of the farmhouse when those calls came, the desert stretching endless before me. Elena watching quietly from the doorway. I thought of my grandfather's letter, of his sharp words. "Your brother knows how to keep wealth. You know how to keep people. Be kinder to them than they were to you. That is the difference that matters." The irony stung. The same mouths that laughed at me now begged for grace. Part of me wanted to hang up to let them taste the full bitterness of their arrogance. But another part remembered the tired lines on Vernon's face at the funeral, the fragility beneath Melissa's glitter, the hollow bravado in Chad's laughter. Maybe wealth had blinded them, but underneath, they were still blood. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I watched the desert sun dip low, casting the vines in molten gold. Forgiveness wasn't easy, not after years of scorn. But perhaps my inheritance wasn't just land and money. Perhaps it was this choice, the power to break the cycle, to prove that mercy could build where greed had destroyed. And as the phone buzzed again in my palm, I whispered to myself, "This is the real test." The calls from my family kept coming, and though bitterness pulled at me like a shadow, my grandfather's words refused to let me ignore them. Be kinder than they were to you. That is the difference that matters. So I chose not revenge, but distance. And in that space, I built something new. Weeks later, I found myself rising with the Arizona sun, not to the sound of traffic or sirens, but to the rustle of vines waking in the desert breeze. With Joe's steady hands, Elena's wisdom, and the help of Antonio's grown children, my cousins by blood, though strangers until now, we began to breathe life back into the vineyard. The land, once brittle, responded to care like an old horse learning trust again. Each row of vines became a thread binding past and present loss and renewal. I wasn't only working the soil, I started teaching again, this time at a community center in town. Retired veterans, single mothers, even teenagers who thought no one noticed them filled the room. I taught history, but more than that, I taught endurance. The Civil War, the Great Depression, the battles fought on foreign shores. I showed them not just the facts, but the lesson that survival isn't about what you keep, but what you can give back when the dust clears. And in their faces, I saw flickers of the same fire my grandfather once demanded of me. Emily came slowly, hesitantly. At first, only letters, then phone calls. Anger doesn't dissolve overnight, especially anger that's mistaken love for abandonment. But when she read her great-grandfather's confession, when she saw the vineyard and the family hidden from us all, something softened. One evening she arrived unannounced, her car crunching down the gravel path. I stepped onto the porch and found her standing there, tears trembling but unshed. "You should have told me," she whispered. I didn't know how I admitted. "But I'm telling you now, this is who we are. This is what was left for us." She nodded, and for the first time in years she hugged me without holding back. Life settled into a rhythm. Evenings were no longer silent meals in front of a flickering TV. Instead, we gathered around Elena's worn wooden table, Joe telling stories with hands as animated as his voice, Emily laughing with Antonio's children as if they'd grown up together, and me listening amazed at how quickly strangers could become family when truth finally had a seat. I thought often of Vernon Chad and Melissa. Their tables, I imagined, were heavy with bitterness, but light on love. Their houses, though once dazzling, now echoed with loneliness. The contrast was cruel, and yet clarifying wealth without warmth is a mansion without walls. One night after the dishes had been cleared and the desert air cooled, I sat outside with Antonio's grandson, a boy barely 20, quick-witted, eager. We set up a chessboard beneath the stars, the same game my grandfather once taught me. As he moved his knight clumsily forward, I remembered Charles leaning across a board decades ago, eyes sharp, voice low. "The winner isn't the one who takes the most pieces," I told the boy, echoing the words etched in me. "It's the one who knows which pieces truly matter." He smiled, unsure if he believed me yet. But I did. Because in the end, my inheritance wasn't land or money. It was this moment, a family healed, a daughter returned, a vineyard alive again in the desert. It was the knowledge that I, once the forgotten man, had become the keeper of what mattered most. And as the stars glimmered above, I felt it clear as checkmate. Charles's game was over, and somehow, without ever meaning to, I had won.